Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something deadly wrong there.
And now it's sort of hard to believe that the federal government nationalized and introduced redlining. In a funny way, it wasn't just giving something to whites, it was constructing whiteness. Whiteness meant, as in the past whites had meant being a citizen and being a Christian, it now meant living in the suburbs.
We did have different religious groups. We were mixed up there, but we were an all-white community, and I think it's an unrealistic world. I think there's something sterile about everyone being on the same economic level and everyone being the same color.
Cartoonist Bill Griffith remembers moving from Brooklyn to Levittown as a kid.
It's an untenable artificial world. You're creating a weird utopia in a way. A utopia of middle-class white people who were trying to deny that they were living in a multi-racial world. And how long can you keep that up? You can't keep that up forever.
Basically, the idea of whiteness is who's included, who's part of the family, and it has material consequences. Blacks weren't completely left out of the housing market. The housing market that they were exposed to was largely public housing. And public housing, first of all, was built almost exclusively, with a few exceptions, in the central city. And after World War II, we started building these larger and larger public housing projects, which are called vertical ghettos. All of a sudden, you're concentrating large numbers of poor people of color in one place.
Another federal program, urban renewal, was supposed to make cities more livable. 90% of all housing destroyed by urban renewal was not replaced. 2/3 of those displaced were black or Latino.
Fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
In 1968, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. For the first time, racial language was removed from federal housing policy. Non-white families began moving into traditionally white communities in numbers.
We lived in an apartment, a two-family house in Queens, and when we came here, it was the first time we had bought a house, and I was looking for everything in the storybooks.
The Frisbees moved from Queens to suburban Roosevelt, only a few miles from Levittown. Like the Frisbees, many non-white families would discover the economic value of race in the real estate market. They watched as their homes and neighborhoods in suburbia declined precisely because they had moved into them.
When I moved into a neighborhood, I thought it would stay intact the way it was. On the street that I moved on when I moved there, it was predominantly white. Within 2 years, it was predominantly black.
It was called blockbusting. Real estate agents preyed on the racial fears of white homeowners to get them to sell their homes quickly for less than market value. The homes were resold to non-whites at inflated prices.
Well, they would say, you know, we're having black people move in. Now, I will give you cash if you want to sell me your house. Do you want to stay with black people next door to you? And that's the way it went on. And as Bunny said, a lot of the people just said, yes, I'll take the money and run. And that's the start of the white people leaving.
As more black and Latino families moved to Roosevelt, real estate became more and more depressed, just as the FHA had predicted. But why?
I have an idea my house is probably worth around 120 in this town. But what it would be worth in Wantor or Garden City or some other place, probably around 200,000 or better. Now you're talking about 80,000. You said to me one time about why do people dislike the blacks? Well, money-wise, there's a reason. Not that you dislike the blacks so much, but you dislike what happens when a community turns from white to black.
It wasn't African Americans moving in that caused housing values to go down in Roosevelt and other neighborhoods. It was whites leaving.
And if you think about African Americans, if African Americans are 20% of that market, it means that 80% of the people are not looking in those places for homes. So the prices of those homes declines or stays stable. And banks contribute to this by continually making loans in regions that are on the rise, white communities, and making it difficult to get loans in black communities.
So there's a difference. There's a lack of symmetry that's important to keep in mind. So it's not the same when whites are all by themselves, because when they're all by themselves, they're taking all the resources with them. They're taking all the amenities with them. But when blacks are by themselves, they can't get loans. They don't have a decent tax base. There are no jobs, and then that becomes associated with black space.
In the end, what happened to Roosevelt happens in many neighborhoods when white families and businesses flee. The tax base eroded. Schools and services declined. The town was seen by county officials as a legitimate dumping ground for welfare families. As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, The housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. That house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So if you can get a government loan and with your GI Bill, your newly earned college degree, and buy a house in an all-white area that then appreciates in value, that then you can pass on to your children, then you're passing on wealth that has all been made more available to you as a consequence of racist policies and practices. To the child of that parent, it looks like my father worked hard, bought a house, passed his wealth on to me, made it possible for me to go to school, mortgage that house so I could have, you know, a relatively debt-free college experience and finance my college education. How come your father didn't do that? You know, well, there's some good reasons why maybe your father had a harder time doing it if you're African American or Latino or Native American.
And the thing that's really slick about whiteness, if you will, is that most of the benefits can be obtained without ever doing anything personally. For whites, they're getting the spoils of a racist system, even if they're not personally racist.
To glimpse one of the far-reaching consequences of racial inequality, you need only consider one statistic: comparative net worth or wealth. If you add up everything you own and subtract all your debts, what's left is your net worth.
Today, the average black family has only 1/8 the net worth or assets of the average white family. That difference has seemingly grown since the 1960s, since the civil rights triumphs, and is not explained by other factors like education, earnings rates, savings rates. It is really the legacy of racial inequality from generations past. No other measure captures the legacy, the sort of cumulative disadvantage of race, or cumulative advantage of race for whites than net worth or wealth.
Even with the same income, white families have on average twice the wealth of black families. Much of that difference lies in the value of their homes. But what happens when we compare families along the color line who have similar wealth?
When you make the right comparison, when you compare a black kid from a family with the same income and wealth level as the white kid from the similar economic situation, rates of college graduation are the same. Rates of employment and work hours are the same. Rates of welfare usage are the same. So when we're talking about race in terms of a cultural accounting of these differences or a genetic accounting of these differences, we're really missing the picture because we're making the wrong comparison.